And welcome back. We are now going to go ahead and get ready to continue working our game and start implementing the questions that we want to do. But instead of putting these directly into code, what we're going to do is use something called a scriptable object to go ahead and handle that for us. So what exactly is a scriptable object when we start looking at it? Well, scriptable objects are simply just containers for our data. In this case, the data is our questions and our answers. Instead of loading all this data into a script and having, for example, giant conditionals that we have to manage, this is going to place the data instead into the scriptable object. This is kind of advantageous for us because it's going to save in memory since the data can be stored in a single location rather than having to have this giant reference sheet that needs to go through. And unlike a script, it does not need to be attached to a game object, which can be very advantageous in terms of things like cutting down the bulk of your program and stuff like that, making it more efficient. Now, scriptable objects can also have the benefit of acting as a template when we start looking at consistency purposes. And that's anything from making sure we have, for example, the right number of questions and answers to, much broader things that as we start expanding beyond this simple quiz game, where you're going to start seeing some of these applications come into play. Now, again, as I mentioned, we're going to use them to store the question data for our game. So we're using these into a very simple purpose, but it's a good introduction. And so what is the scriptable object going to have? Well, it's going to have the question text, it's going to contain the possible answers, and it's going to have the correct answers. All right, so before we go ahead and start working with scriptable objects, we are noticing that we're starting to get a lot of things just in our root asset folder here. And while that's okay, it can make things a little bit messy. So I'm actually going to do a quick bit of cleanup here. So let's go to our text mesh pro folder and just expand that. And if you look, we have a couple things in here. We have a folder called fonts and we have a folder called fonts and materials. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my assets and I'm going to grab my fonts. So just my regular font right here, whichever font you have, you're just going to grab that and drag that into your fonts folder. And then your font object here, you're going to grab that asset and drag that into fonts and materials. And so we're just going to move that right into that folder. So that way, again, it's not here cluttering up our assets folder. Now we do have this button here, and the button currently is not named. So I'm just going to go ahead and rename that. And since this is, of course, controlling our answers that we're going to choose, or we can call it answer button, we could call it choice button, whatever you want to have it be, as long as it's something more appropriate than just button because we want it to be descriptive. So I'm just going to call this answer choice button. Okay, and since it's, of course, just sitting out here, let's go ahead and give it a folder. And since I made this into a prefab, I'm going to make a folder called prefabs. And then I'm going to drag answer choice into my prefabs folder. And so now it's going to live in here. Now when I look at my hierarchy, there's not too much that needs to be cleaned up here. I'm just going to collapse a couple of these so they're just kind of out of the way. And instead I'm going to focus on the question canvas here. So for example, we have text TMP. Well, that's not very helpful for us because we know that's not what it's representing. So I'm just going to go ahead and rename that to the question text. And I could go ahead and rename my buttons too. So these, of course, we said before was answer choice button. But I can go ahead and just rename this first one to, let's just say, answer button. And I'm going to give this a index of 0 because this is going to be the first button here that we're going to deal with. Now, the only thing is that these now have different names, so I'm just going to kind of cheat a little bit here and delete these so I don't have to go through and re-add them and then just duplicate answer button, and you'll see it automatically re-adds all those numbers. So now I have 0, 1, 2, 3. And the reason why I'm doing 0 here is because it has to do with how when you build a list a lot of times, it's going to start at a value of 0. And so we'll talk more about that when we start looking at arrays and stuff like that. But we're going to go ahead and assume anytime we're starting a list like this, we're going to use 0 as our starting value. All right, last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come back down to my assets folder. And I'm going to make 2 new folders. So I'm going to make a folder for the scripts because we're going to store all those in there. And I'm going to make a folder for our questions because we're going to end up storing all those questions in there. So let's go ahead and just name one called questions. All right, and now that everything's all set there, we are now actually ready to begin work on our scriptable objects. So the very first thing we're doing, we're going to our scripts folder. And let's go ahead and make ourselves a C# script. And let's just go ahead and name this as question. And since these are scriptable objects, we can, of course, call this, for example, scriptable object, or we can just put SO. But either way, we want to make sure that we have a differentiation so we know what these are for. So I'm going to call this question scriptable and the OBJ. And then now once that is complete, let's go ahead and open that up into Visual Studio. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the start and update methods because I'm not going to need this for the script. But instead I want to focus now on where it says model behavior. Now up to this point, all of our scripts have been through model behavior, but we're actually going to use a different approach here because we're making a scriptable object. We're actually going to go ahead and start typing scriptable object, and you can see we get the option for right here. So this is a scriptable object type, and you can see even though question scriptable object is here, we want this scriptable object. And then we're also going to want to add in something else. So we're going to go ahead and get our square brackets ready here so we can go ahead and add in a menu. And so when we go ahead and start typing create, you can see we get the option to create an asset menu. And then just go ahead and we'll close this out with a set of parentheses. And let's just save this. And now we're going to go back over to Unity to go ahead and actually do a little bit of work. And we're going to end up doing some bouncing back and forth between these as we actually start putting things into our game. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and here in Unity, now that we've created that script, remember we had a option here that we create a scriptable object. And if I go ahead and right click over here in my project side here, not inside the actual scripts folder, but if I right click here and I click on create, you can see we now can create a question scriptable object. And you'll see it creates a object here for us. Now this object currently doesn't have much to it, so I'm actually just going to go ahead and delete this so we can actually give it some more value. So we're going to go back over to Visual Studio to go ahead and do that. Alright, and so what we're going to do is that we're now going to go right here into our create asset menu, and we're going to create our menu name, and we want this to be our, of course, our option for what do we want this to be. Well, this is going to be, should be our quiz question, and then of course we'll want to rename that file. Remember it came back as this kind of just generic thing. We want this to be a lot more helpful and useful, so we're actually going to rename that file that's generated as a new question. And let's go ahead and save that. So now in Unity, if I go ahead and do that same thing, if I go ahead and right click on my scripts folder and do create, you'll see the option is now a quiz question. So we're changing what that shows up as. And when I create that, you'll see that it now creates a new question. Now notice there's nothing in here for us to actually work with, so we need to go ahead and populate that in here. Alright, and so what we're going to do is we want to pretty much create the ability for us to have those questions. So we're going to go inside of our class now, and the way we want to do this is we want to control this through the inspector. We don't want to necessarily have to come into our code every time we do this. So we're going to do this through a serialized field. And what we're going to set this up is a string, because it's simply just going to be a set of text that we're going to be controlling this through. Now you can call it anything appropriate. So for example, I might just call this question, and I'm just going to give it a kind of a starting value. So for example, this might be a new question text here. All right, it doesn't have to be anything specific because again, we can control that eventually through our inspector. Checking on our scriptable object, if I go ahead and click on that new question, you can see that my question now says new question text here, which is awesome. I can now go ahead and click in here, I can edit this, but there is one thing I do want to point out is that this text box, if I just go ahead and start filling this with random keyboard smash, you'll notice it just keeps going. I can't see everything that might be in there, which of course can present to us a small problem. So we need to go ahead and change one thing here in our code to actually be able to fix this so we can see this question text a lot better. Now the way we're going to control that option is we actually have to add one more thing here. So we're going to go right above our serialized field, and we're going to go ahead and bring in something called text area. And text area is going to allow us to control the size of that text box that we have. Now, of course, in this case, when we look at that, we have to think how many minimum lines do we want this to be? Because the way the text area works is it takes in two values. So it takes in a minimum value and a maximum value. So we might say, you know, we want the minimum of, let's just say, 1 line of text, and we can have a maximum of, let's say, 5 lines of text. And of course, you can adjust that around for your game to find the thing that's most comfortable for you. So if we save that and then go look at our results back in Unity, you can see now that when I come in here, I'm just going to go ahead and click in here. It looks pretty similar, except now you can see it's a little different in our appearance. But if I just start holding down keys, you'll notice that it keeps going, because now I can add in more text. Now I don't necessarily want this to be infinite. All right, you can see it's starting to scroll, because again, when I go ahead and do that, the issue that I might run into otherwise is that, you know, we could have things literally going outside of our canvas. So 1 to 5 is a good range here for us to work with, or at least to get started. And again, we can adjust that as we need to. Now, this is the point where we can actually go ahead and start building our questions. So what are those questions we actually want to have in our game? And it's very easy. So for example, let's just say I want to have questions about game development, or I want questions about computer science or technology. I can go ahead and start framing these in here. So for example, I might say, what is computer science? And again, I can worry about these questions later. Or I might ask, what is a scriptable object? And so this could be a good way for you to kind of use this as a review. So let's just say I want to use this as one of my questions. And so I can go ahead and rename this. So instead of being new question, let's call this question 1. I can go ahead and make this so I have more questions. So I'm going to go ahead and challenge you now. I'm not going to go ahead and show you. I'm going to come with my own questions, but you can have your own. And I'm going to go ahead and create, let's say, 5 questions that we can pull from, just so we have enough to kind of get our game started. But I want to challenge you. Go ahead, create your own questions. It doesn't have to be the exact same questions as mine, but you go ahead and create 5 questions. And I'll give you a little hint here. You can actually just go ahead and duplicate these objects when you have one selected. So Control D to duplicate, and that will make the next object for you. So again, go ahead and make 5 of those. Load your own questions, and let's see what you come up with.